Uinta County, because that's where we're at. So Fort Bridger's trading post was built in 1843. Now, Uinta County with Fort Bridger and the Shoshone camps in the Bridger Valley is one of the longest continuously occupied spots in the state. There have been people here for 14,000 years, but the most continuously occupied county in the state is Uinta. People over there at Laramie, that were Fort Laramie, don't let them lie to you. They moved in and out like please. So this, don't say that. But anyway, this is the longest occupied county in the state. Add to this the building of the Transcontinental Railroad to the county in 1868, and there's a legacy of firsts in the county. In 1868, Union Pacific Railroad built west up Muddy Creek over the Bear River Divide, then down the Bear River to Evanston, where it turned west towards Wasatch and its descent down Echo, then Weber Canyon. Now guys, I'm going to stop right here. One thing that I was telling you about when I was trying to build an environment around, this is hard work. And you just could not get people to come here and stay. You get your paycheck and you leave. Union Pacific had a little bit of a problem, and that had a little bit of an advantage. How are you going to leave? You're going to take the train. Well, they're not going to give you a railroad ticket if they need railroad workers, so you can't get the train. So what's your next best option? You're going to steal horses. Union Pacific spent a lot of money guarding their horses at night. Because you ain't walking out of here. You know, you might take a walk to Salt Lake that way. So they were running short of workers. Archaeology provides one window into the world created by the Union Pacific, and combined with historical record, the history of Wyoming section camps is rich in texture. Large numbers of immigrants first found work on the railroads and the coal mines in Wyoming, and these are the 5 areas that I'm going to focus on as we go. Evanston is a railroad community that comes into existence in November 1868. It doesn't, November, December. The following 1868 map for Utah Territory places Evanston in Utah Territory, and the map also shows the railroad in Evanston. Now, what I was trying to draw on this board up here is actually articulated here. If you notice the panhandle, the Utah right there, that panhandle is further to the east than what it really is on the survey map. So in the first map that was made in 1868 of Utah and Nevada together, it shows this being in part of Utah. That was changed immediately. So by the next set of maps that you've got, you have Evanston clearly inside of Wyoming territory. So it reached here in 1868, and I'm showing you this because of the problem that I was just describing about four ties. The federal government investigated Union Pacific, not enough in my opinion, but investigated Union Pacific, and they said they were just laying sticks down and putting rails on it, saying that they completed rails. The railroad from Ogden to Promontory Point was so bad that they said that was not capable of holding trains. Now, they'd already united the rails there. So what Union Pacific did was basically give the line from Promontory Point to Ogden to CPR, Central Pacific Railroad, so that they could improve the railroad there. They had more better qualified workers, because a lot of the workers for the Union Pacific Railroad exited real quick after 1869 to find other work. So that's how this happened. But that shows you in this particular photograph how bad the ties are. Of course, the rails aren't laid on this. They tried to put them too far apart. So in 1869, Charles S. Savage photographed a Latter-day Saint graver camp in Echo Canyon from Starbuck County. From here to Ogden, a lot of the rail beds were laid by Latter-day Saints. So the rail bed and the rails were laid. And it was said by no more important historian than Bancroft, the Bancroft Award is given for the best history written every year. No more better historian than Bancroft said they were some of the best graders and some of the best construction workers that were around. Understanding that they had been in Utah for a long period of time, understood the soils, understood how to cut the stone, how to make the abutments that they needed for the bridge. It was no wonder that the Brigham Young was courted by both Central Pacific Railroad and Union Pacific Railroad to provide employees. Alney had two different types of employees in 1868, two different groups, and that's the types, two different groups of people that were employed in 1869 to open those mines, Latter-day Saints and Chinese. So Brigham Young organized contracting companies which employed 1,000 Utah laborers to grade through the territory before UP and CP trains laid the tracks. Track laying still was left to the purview of UP. Railroad construction apparently did not end with the completion of Transcontinental Railroad. This is Deep Creek Road near Nebraska. Now this describes what we're seeing. Mike, I'm going back. I really did have to work for a living once. I worked for my father-in-law, and he had a great road. They both were private contractors in the paint business. So I asked my uncle-in-law, I says, how cold does it have to be before you stop painting? He says, well, if I'm broke, I'll paint icicles. Well, in this case right here, they're broke and they're going to lay rails in this snow, and you shouldn't do it because you can't compact the bed. The bed's too wet. It's either wet or frozen. So what happens in the spring, that thing swells up and pops up. You don't have a good rail bed. And you've got all kinds of problems. That requires section camps to be built along the way so that they can ensure repairs were made at time and on time, and that they didn't have to wait. So the railroad and section camps. Now, this right here, were established in intervals of approximately 6 miles apart. Now, that's not the case, a little bit more than that. By Central Union Pacific Railroads. And they accommodated workers, repairmen, foremen responsible for maintaining railways. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, section camps became increasingly important. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you because I've kind of given this to you before. The size of the permanent camp was dependent on the resources available. If you had water, if you had coal, if you had wood, your section camp had a greater chance of surviving and becoming a town later on. There's not too many of them that happened with. To ensure the size of the camp fluctuated, when necessary, they were used to house seasonal laborers, and bunkhouses or cars were provided to accommodate workers and crews. The railroad cars were used as accommodations when they were building the railroad tracks. In fact, the longest train was behind them, where they had lived in bunkhouses behind the track layers. And they would come out of those, so they were a moving, living community, and that's what they put at the section camps also. Okay, nitty-gritty. So in 1876, do you see the number of section camps that were here? By 1893, you see less section camps. That's because, that's because of an improvement in the technology. They were making better steel rails, they were making better rail neighbors that hold the rail to the tie. They were getting better ties. They could chip ties from greater distance. They could bring in hardwood ties. They could do all kinds of things. So you see the number of section camps begin to diminish. And it shows the distance in the miles between the section camps. So Millis, from Hillard to Millis was only 4 miles, but there were reasons for that because of the coke facilities at Hillard. For one reason they were there. But you can see they're diminishing. That's because of improvement in technology. From 1870 to 1880, every one of those white spots is a section camp. And they would have between 5 to 100 people at those section camps, depending on repairs needed to be made and the number of things that had occurred. But each one of those white dots is inhabited in that particular period of time. And it's good to look at who lived and worked in these section camps. Initially, Chinese repaired the railroads in Wyoming between 1868 and 1869, but quickly were employed to work in southwestern Wyoming coal mines. By 1875, 150 Chinese men lived in Albany and north of Evanston in the coal mines. How many of you know the history of coal mining in Albany? It's one of my favorite towns to study. It had the first mine disaster west of the Mississippi where there was an explosion, and you could feel it here. It says in the newspaper, I can't remember if it was a chieftain or which one it was, they said that you could feel and hear it all the way through here. Primarily the people that were killed were Chinese. And because we don't have good written records of the Chinese, we don't know what they went through. But because there were Latter-day Saints in there, I think it would be a branch, for you guys that know, the branch at Albany had several Latter-day Saint members that were killed. And one man was burned over much of his body. I won't say much of his body, and he had to recover. They document this in the branch records of his recovery and how bad the burns were that he had from that explosion up there. And one thing that triggered my imagination, he says, and we feel for the Chinese men that were burned too. Who is taking care of them? Believe it or not, one of the first hospitals constructed was constructed here in Evanston at Chinatown and built by Osei. So Osei built a hospital in Chinatown, and partially it was to tend to people like had been injured in Albany. Now that wasn't just for Chinese, it was for anybody that came. Evanston has a good record of good medical care shortly around that period of time. The state hospital here functioned in multiple ways, but there was good care in both Rock Springs and Evanston that astounds me of how early it came. The state miners hospital was put inside of Rock Springs. By the way, Evanston and Rock Springs were given the opportunity to apply for the university, but being a good Colorado State University graduate, I understood why they didn't want one on there. Don't stop. Okay, but anyway, going back to this, there was a large number of people working in these mines. So the chronology, from 69 to 74, Chinese immigrants were recruited to work in western Wyoming on the railroad and coal mines. They were recruited by Sisson and Wallace, this is just summarizing, and began to arrive at Albany, Wasatch, and Evanston between 1869 and 1871. Sisson and Wallace and Union Pacific utilized Osage to move Chinese to where they were needed along the railroad line. In the 1880s, Japanese were first referred to as working on the railroad in Wyoming, with the numbers increasing between the 1890s and 1900. Now, when I come back to this in a minute, they also began to recruit people from New Mexico at this particular time. Thank you for your patience. Hampton, which is also in Union County, is one of my favorite section camps that we built. It has a good artifact assemblage, and it's a mixed camp. The railroad construction camp that was there, it lasted a long time. Shortly after the Union Pacific constructed the railroad north of Fort Bridger at Hampton in 1868, they found out that Muddy Creek was tearing out the railroad. So what they did was they took their Chinese laborers and they rerouted the river. So they carved the river into solid bedrock so that it wouldn't downcut or side cut so that the water would flow away from the railroad tracks. The railroad track in 1868 is this strip right here. This is what they built. So they hand cut this and rerouted Muddy Creek, and that's where the water still flows. That area north of there is a bird sanctuary. It's one of those critical water areas, and that's because of the fact that water still seeps underneath it, but it doesn't cut through the rail. So whenever they have downpours, like you guys do, because you live here, when they have the heavy downpours because of heavy rain episodes, or heavy water runoff from the snow melt, that would cut through the side of that, and so it's a pretty interesting thing that this thing has lasted that long, but they rerouted it. So there's the new channel, there's the 1868 grade. A section of railroad camps like Hampton provided insights into the smaller Chinese communities, and the original railroad grade is seen right here. That was taken in, it is still intact. That was taken about 20 years ago, 30 years ago. This is railroads that they would construct, and the problem here is, okay, for you guys that know, what's the problem with putting a railroad like they did right there? Huh? The washouts, yeah. Washouts and rock slides. So the washouts and the rock slides become a problem. That rubble that you see to the far end of this place right here is because of the fact that when it would come down, they'd have the landslides down there, they'd take and dump it and begin to make that wider. They really needed to cut up the side of the mountain. We live here, we know what it's like. The Chinese railroad workers diverted Muddy Creek, and it's still, this is Hampton, 1868, this is the farms out there. It's still where the water flows, which I really like. That's the original water course, and it flows to the north. While they rerouted Muddy Creek, the Chinese lived in semi-subterranean houses, in other words, dugouts. We know a little bit about what they ate due to excavations at Aspen Section Camp and artifacts found on the surface. So this is a surface scatter, and these are ceramics. What I'm going to do here is go through this a little bit quickly for time purposes here, and just show you the photographs of items that we found. And the stone foundations at Hampton were built where people were going to stay a long time. These are Chinese railroad workers taking out the bedding. You have to have a good bedding to put this in. So you have to crush the rock, put it in there. You have to put this on a gravel bed. You have to have that bed to work, and that's a constant job. Uploading ballast or gravel at the section camp. This was a constant job, a permanent job. These are Chinese workers here in Evanston, they say. And this is an example of them clearing the snow with a plow. The greatest invention for Union Pacific was a rotary plow, because it would send it around. What happens with these things, and you get this from this photograph here, is that it pushes up and creates its own snowdrift, and the people have to get off the train and shovel the snowdrift so they can continue to push the snow so that they can move farther forward and get the train going. Shoveling snow, especially at Aspen, is difficult. Snow often filled the cut east of Aspen, and this isn't Aspen, but I love this picture, stuck in the snow like a railroad car. Okay, so anyway, we're going to move forward here. This is Aspen 1874, when you see that black spot in the center. And this is the type of houses they lived in. Now these type of houses are 12 by 18, I believe they are, and you load them on flatbeds and you move them to the section camp where you needed them. After the Chinese massacre, when they brought everybody from here back to Rock Springs, they loaded the flatbed cars with houses from section camps up at Twin Creeks, and then loaded them from over by Burn and by Point of Rocks, and brought them in. The massacre occurred on September 2nd. The Chinese were driven out of Almy on September 3rd. On September 9th, they were all moved to Rock Springs, the people that wanted to go. This is a big myth in the newspaper. You wanted to go, you didn't have any money. They didn't take non-volunteers. They went to Rock Springs, and Union Pacific rebuilt Chinatown in 1885. By September the 9th, they had a place to stay, either by living in the railroad cars or by these type of houses being brought there. This one was from Aspen right here, is from what we can tell. Now, this is not the drawing from Aspen, but that half of the house is the one that we excavated in Aspen. So we have a good idea of what was around the configuration of the structure. They moved that up and they had that town going. What's interesting is that in 1885, the returning people from the massacre, one had been shot, carried a bullet with him the rest of his life. He died with a bullet in his back. Stayed there for 40 years, from 1885 to 1925, when they retired and were taken back to China. They sent letters home, and because of those letters home, we have been able to work with our Chinese colleagues and be able to get the name of different individuals who had returned home and find out what their Chusendi was, their place of birth, and get this information. One of the survivors that was there, remember this, some of them worked there for 40 years after the massacre, they lived there for 40 years. One of those survivors is a woman by descendant of the survivors of Beth Lou Williams. She just won the Bancroft Award for the best history written in the United States. So they didn't disappear, and neither did all these other people. A lot of people stayed. My friend Joe Bozovich, who was born in Cumberland, he stayed until he passed away in Rock Springs. Okay, same thing, different story. This is a bunkhouse. And you can see by where this is in Maitland, Utah, where they set the bunkhouse. And you only see 3 permanent houses. Those houses that I just showed you were never set to be there for a long period of time. They were moved around. The same thing with the tents. They moved around the tents. Okay, this is map. This is Aspen, and it shows you the Chinese residents in 1880. I'm sorry, guys. I'll give you this slide show if you want it. I'll leave it for somebody to copy, because I'm sorry that I have to move along. You were patient to wait for me, and I appreciate it. You see that list of animals there? Trust me on this one, because if I start reading you Latin names, it's a good time to go to sleep. But you can see on the top we had everything from badger all the way to fish that were imported that were consumed by the residents of Aspen. They were brought in by the train. They ate porcupine, they ate badger, and they ate fish from Sacramento. I can't remember the name of that fish. That's what that's the point. Railroads and their maintenance facilities are important worldwide. Wide open spaces between towns throughout the world create challenges in maintaining railroads. So, being a good Wyoming boy, I went to study what it looks like in other places in Mongolia. Do you see the difference between the 2 places here? No, Wyoming is America's answer to Outer Mongolia. Outer Mongolia is Asia's answer to Wyoming. Yeah. These are the trains that they run up and down those tracks. That's the railroad lines in yellow that they have inside of Mongolia, and they cover the same type of distance. They're slightly different trains, but that's the Trans-Siberian Railroad across through there. Lake Baikal is that blue thing in the south. You can go all the way to Beijing from Russia on the railroads that these guys built. The railroad was built south of Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, to Beijing by Chinese workers. From Ulaanbaatar, which is towards the north, from Ulaanbaatar to Siberia, it was built by Russians. So there were different people building these at this time. Well, they had to have section houses. And what I think is good is to go to a place where people are not necessarily living like they live here now, but like they lived in the 1800s. And what you find is that they have cattle that they raise inside their town. They're relying on wild game, and they import food that they want. But basically what they do is they turn to what land will give them. The best way to make money in Wyoming is to have cows and sheep. One more digression. My son went to Yale. He's an archaeologist. I'm an archaeologist. I work for free for him. I got to say I work for Yale, but I work for my son. My son is not a good person to work for. Do not let him hire him. He paid me nothing except for the trip. But what we would do is the cow costs a lot of money because we buy the sheep. And I began to become enamored with sheep. And these guys, if they want a sheet. They pay what they pay in Ulaanbaatar for the sheep. They pay $100 for the sheep, and that lasts for 2 weeks. They graze the sheep there, they butcher the sheep, and they don't waste any part of the sheep. I will not go into details. They waste nothing. They take the cape and make it into clothing. They use it to make their ears. But in the section camps, they're stuck and they're stationary, and they can't move around a herd, but their animals can. Just like there was here in the 19th century, these guys still do most of their work by manual. And when the ties that they removed from the railroad are removed and they're told to throw them away, don't do it. Make your house out of the railroad ties. And it's just real good common sense. Notice the lack of trees that they have in common. This is the section camp that I did my analysis on. And this is the fruit on it. Not being satisfied in just studying Mongolia, I went to Australia to study the rails across Australia. And part of that reason is that stretch across the Red Desert is one of the worst stretches that you can build a railroad across, because you've got frost heaving, you've got heat and cold differentiating, you've got the wind, you've got all kinds of problems. You've got alkali soils. The alkalinity will actually rot some of the old iron. It will cause it to rot. So I went to Australia to see what they did in their desert. And I did some research, and I read up on it, and it says you can die in the Nullarbor, which is the great desert in the west. You can die within a week. And I thought, I'm not going to do this, because I drove. I'm not going to do this. I wanted to do the studies on it. I says, I'm not going to do this. I could die. But then after I read that, I was camped up at Jack Morrow Creek in the windstorm doing some work for the college, for the archaeology people there. I said, if I get out of this car, I can die in 5 minutes. I'll take my chances in the Nullarbor, because you can freeze it a lot faster than you can get. I'll tell you one more quick story. Where the red line is where I drove. So that red line's where I drove. I drove from Brisbane to Perth, and I got out there in the middle of the desert, and they don't have electrical lines out there. It's kind of like what they would face here. If you wanted electricity here, and they had electricity early in Wyoming. By 1882, they had it in Rock Springs. 1882 in Laramie, 1885 in Rock Springs, they had electricity. So they created generator plants all the way around. Well, in the Nullarbor, what they have is the diesel generators that they do. And when I was in the Navy, that's one thing we had to learn how to repair, was the diesel generators on the destroyers and aircraft. And they're real efficient. But I got out there and I stopped, and the guy asked me how long it'd take me to get from Brisbane to where I was at in the Nullarbor. I was almost all the way across. I said 3.5 days. He said, "You're hired. You're going to hire me to be a truck driver." I knew better. They couldn't trick me. So this is a section camp. They're smaller, and because you guys are so patient with me, I am going to ask a question. Why do you think that the section camps are smaller in Australia than they are here?
Wood is scarcer.
Huh?
The wood is scarcer.
But yeah, the wood is the buildings would be there. The dugouts is what they did to compensate. Well, most of these places out there digging underground, they put it underground. Besides, it helps the heat is cooler underground. It's warmer underground here. But that's a good guess. That's a real good guess. Technology changes. That's a good one too. The technology changes. You don't need as many people, and I've already said that is why they disappeared. The technology changes. But there's another reason.
People are bigger.
Huh?
People were bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is an archaeological rule. You carry the heaviest thing the least farthest. That's something you can live with. If there's anything that archaeologists come up with, you carry it over time. You don't keep carrying heavy things with you. The heaviest thing that we transport, we don't think about too much now, is water. Water weighs, somebody correct me, because every time I say this I'm wrong. I think for 5 gallons is 39 pounds. You can look it up. You can look it up online. But it's heavy. You have to carry that water. Because of the fact that there is no water out here, they had to limit the number of people they had, because the consumption of water was for the trains. So you were on rations in a lot of places for water. So and some people would argue that this is one of the reasons that I was told, of course you live long enough and told everything. And they made square water tanks. They weren't round water tanks for the water to come out. They made square water tanks. Of course they have emus out here, but this is their water tanks that they constructed for the steam engines. It is flat. Tanks to store water for steam engines were and are critical features in section camps worldwide. These two had to be maintained. If you're going to put in a water tank, you've got to make sure that your water tank is maintained, that it doesn't rust, that it doesn't get filled up with dirt, dust because of the blowing wind. You have to maintain those water tanks. Now that brings us back to here. I'm going to do a little bit of skipping into Sweetwater County. Sweetwater County loves Uinta County, just so you know, except for when we play you in football. My son played against Evanston High School and he beat him every time. I'm not happy still. Okay. but anyway, this is at the edge of Sweetwater, not the edge of Sweetwater County. This is above the Green River. When you guys drive to Rock Springs and go down to Green River, you got to go down to the Scarp to get to the river. That was difficult to come through, but it was easy to cut. But they had to put in a cut. And when they had to put in a cut, they had to have a large number of people there to cut down into the stone and create it. Later on in 1910, when they expanded it and put in 2 tracks, they had to put a double cut. So they put in a double cut there at Green River. So they had to build a section camp at a place called Peru. And I do not know why they named it Peru, but they have this camp at Peru that becomes a long-lived camp at the top of that crest of that hill. And the intriguing thing about it is, it lasted longer than most section camps do. Just a reminder about the snow. This is the cut as it comes up. The Lincoln Highway came up through here. The Overland Trail came up through here to a little bit to the south of this, but they had the double track. Peru section camp was built atop the ridge the Union Pacific had to ascend to come out of the valley. And it first was constructed in '68. By the time that it gets to the point that they want double tracks so they can pass each other, Harrington does this at the turn of the century. The Chinese workers have all moved away from the railroads. Most of them were left in mining or merchandise. And most of the workers were here were Japanese. And you can see that the style of the section house had improved because people demanded better habitation at the turn of the century than they did earlier. They wanted a substantial house to live in. They weren't going to move here unless you provided with housing. And that followed with the construction in the boom. They might bring in trailers, they might bring in something else, but people weren't going to live in tents. Of course, I didn't go to college teachers didn't get paid much. That's it. But at first, I had to get a place. So you can see this train coming up there. It was in circa 1935. Peru lasted from 1868 to 1960, so it was one of the longer-lived section camps. So going back from here, you can see Piedmont, Leroy, Bridger, Carter, Campton, Church Beach, Granger, Marston, and Peru. Then Green River. So the Peru is in red right there. You can see how many section camps used to be there. It was one of the last ones left. It was continuously occupied. And because of that, there are all kinds of artifacts at this place. That's its boom and its bane. You have everything from whiskey bottles to salt shakers and other items. We excavated this site about 20 years ago. Sorry, 20 years ago. This right here is a whiskey flask. Peru was extremely diverse population. By far the majority of tea and tableware in the assemblies was Japanese in origin. So that shows a change from Chinese to Japanese. These beautiful vases, they're everywhere. We had Chinese ware there too, and what that shows us is that the Chinese also moved into this community at the turn of the century and later. So all of the artifacts, and by years of production, the peak was 1890 to 1900. The people moved in there at 1900 in the highest numbers when they were building the second rail cut through there. And so by analyzing the artifacts were there, the type of artifacts that are there, we gain a pretty good idea of what's happening. What time is it? Okay, I'm going to try to wrap this up real quick because you guys have been so patient with it. I want to show you something that archaeologists like to figure with. They like to do numbers. And when I do numbers, the reptilian portion of my mind takes over and I can't speak, so just bear with me. If you look at that, you see that peak in the numbers there at tea and tableware? When people have low money, they'll spend a lot of their money on high-end china. Because technically, we used to talk about this when we were talking about sharecroppers and analyzing sharecropper archaeology. Technically, put your money in tableware because people rarely repossess your tableware because of the fact that you've been licking it and using the spoon. So it's not a repossessionable item. So they spend money on what I would call better chinaware in times when money is low, you know? But that might not be a fact. If you guys learn something different, you tell me because I'm willing to change my mind. I'll give up on a bad idea quick. But the artifacts by category show that at the peak occupation, they had really high-end plates and dinnerware. Just beautiful motifs, just excellent wares. So I had a student who wanted to do a master's thesis, so James is his name, don't ask me his last name. But he was from Illinois State University. That's where Powell was at, the guy where John Wesley Powell was from. He went and he did the analysis of this and compared it, I'm putting the background of snow there because of the fact that it was a pretty dusty place to live in. The overland route for Lincoln Highway that comes right through here went through Peru, and it lasted a little bit longer than it would have lasted with just stayed as railroad section camp. Section camps that were repurposed would last longer. So the section camps that are in that type of ilk would be Granger to a degree. But Granger, as you know, is not what it was. Point Rocks would be another one. And then those are section camps that lasted long periods of time. Most of them disappeared. Well, Peru lasted longer because it began to cater to the car industry. And because of that, it lasted longer than most. It's what's diversity of it that gets me. So the diversity, I'll run through this real quick and then we'll stop here, was Ireland, England, Norway, France, Germany, Austria, Sweden, Finland, Canada, Japanese, Greek, Armenian, and Mexican. What happens in 1890 is a large number of New Mexicans come to live and work in Wyoming. So they're listed in this. They're listed on the census as either Mexicans or as New Mexicans. They'll be listed both ways. Understanding part of the reason I started with this, in 1843, this is Mexico. On the census records for 1850 that the church took for Bridger Valley, there were a whole plethora of people that were born in quote unquote Mexico. What happens in 1900 becomes a stabilizing factor in the labor pool is that you begin to hire more people from New Mexico and Mexico so that you have a consistent labor pool that's not being brought over from around the world. These people on the left find jobs in other places. The Hispanics become people that are real schooled at being able to repair the railroad, and they're more mobile and they'll go back home. So you've got a difference, you've got a change in who the ethnic groups are on the railroad. This is what I just showed you on that last thing was there. So, do you have any questions? I'm going to talk about. Thank you for coming, guys. Thank you. So I'm going to stop right here.
I was interested in Carter.
Yes.
Carter was a section camp, and if you drive out by Carter now, there's a whole bunch of abandoned buildings out there.
Yeah.
Looks like a church, maybe a hotel. So did that become a town, or was that part of the section camp?
That's actually a good question because that Carter would be another example of a community that emerged from a section camp into becoming a little bit of a town. It's partially because it was a crossroads between the Bridger Valley and Kimmer. In talking about other immigrant groups, which I really like studying, there were a lot of Italians that moved into the Kimmer and specifically to Cumberland. Cumberland had a large number of Italians and a large number of Slovenians that lived there. They're from all over old Yugoslavia. And they would come to Bridger Valley and grow fruits like the Georges is the longest lived group of that. We did oral interviews with the Georges. They're Italian, and what they did was they stayed. Well, Carter, the Carter section place is a good place to stop. You're about ready to get into the valley. It's a good place to stop and get gas, a good place to stop and get a snack. So Carter survived because of the north-south traffic from Kimmer down. That's what I think gave it its longevity. Prior to that, it was the primary supply point for Fort Bridger up until 1890 when they abandoned the fort. When they abandoned the fort in 1890, it was no longer the supply point. The reason it prospered so long and did so well is because of the military. So troops came in and out, but they were shipped by trains. During the Chinese massacre, they were shipped by trains from Fort Douglas and from Fort Steele to Rock Springs and to Evanston. You guys know you're pretty well sitting on top of Camp Medicine that was built in 1885 to protect the miners from Walming and to protect the Chinatown here. And that lasted for 2 or 3 more years. Things changed as they did, and the detachment was sent to Rock Springs. But when they had the military in this particular place, that was where they debarked, they had a tendency to last longer. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Oh, there's another thing too. Go ahead.
one follow-up, because when you drive to Carter right now, if you sit by the railroad track and you look around at the buildings, you'll see great big signs that say no trespassing in Pacific property. So I'm wondering who owned those buildings, because right now it's, nobody can walk around there unless you're trespassing on UP property.
There's still private people who own some of that.
Yeah, what they did, the property was transferred to them. So, if you were in a federal section and you built your house on a federal section, like I think Carter did, I've got the records for Carter purchasing that. I think if you build it for a private person, then it transfers just like all other things do. So, like the property that's adjacent to the Chinatown here, the person that bought that property or bought the Union Pacific property, I'll